Welcome to the last unit, the last two chapters. Skipping ahead to 52 and then chapter 53. Make sure you're doing your reading and taking notes. Unit 8 is ecology. Ecology. This is the kind of grandest, largest scale at which biology looks at life. Almost every other unit we've talked about, we've been, looking at DNA molecules or chemical reactions within a cell or how cells interact with each other. Only last unit with evolution did we look at, populations and larger scopes of life on Earth. And this again is the largest scope. So when it comes to ecology, we're basically looking at how organisms interact with each other and interact with the non-living parts of the environment. So this is about interactions between living and non-living components. What is a non-living part of the environment that would matter to a living thing?
It's surroundings. It's
like
habitat. Water.
Okay, yeah, water. Water. How much water is in the habitat? The temperature. How much sunlight does it get? How windy is it? Wet or dry? Humidity. What type of rocks are in the area? A lot of these things have an effect on life, and they are very important even though they themselves are not living. Again, you have these slides, so I wouldn't be too concerned with writing down every bit of it, but we are certainly, with ecology, interested in interactions between living and non-living. Now, you can do this on a variety of scales. So there's all these different fields of ecology. You really I couldn't imagine the AP exam asking you to discern between these terms. But I do want you to understand that you can look at how one living thing is affected by its environment or how it affects its environment. You can look at a population, a variety of populations, entire systems of land and the populations and diversity that live there. You can look at an even larger, more than just a region, but an entire swath of regions, or on a global scale. So you can look anywhere from a single living thing to every living thing on Earth. And there is a field of biology and, avenues of research that exist on all these levels. So it's a very diverse field with a lot in it to study. Now, this chapter starts out by talking a lot about climate. So it focuses a lot on the non-living components of ecology. And I think when it comes down to it, when you talk about the non-living factor that most affects plants and animals and fungus that live in a region, it's that region's climate that is going to have the biggest impact. And as it says here, that basically means the temperature of a region, the precipitation in that region, the light and the wind patterns that affect that region. Those are your four big factors that affect climate, and climate is probably going to be the number one factor that determines, what type of plants, what type of animals, what type of fungus, what type of microbes like bacteria or even viruses that thrive in that area. And you can point to these as reasons why you don't find certain living things in those areas as well. So temperature, precipitation, sunlight, and wind. And we're going to talk about all four of these to some extent today. All right, so climate is going to be very much influenced by kind of how direct of sunlight a region gets. And that in turn is going to typically affect things like wind and precipitation and temperature. So, I mean, I don't like showing slides with words on them that much. So we're going to jump ahead to what really is the number one factor in climate, which is just the Earth's position to the sun and how that changes. So as I hope you know, the Earth is in an orbit around the sun. It rotates along an axis. The Earth itself is at a bit of an angle to the sun, towards, an angle in relative to a plane with the sun. So we have kind of a tilted Earth that is spinning. And depending on the time of year, the part of the Earth that you are on may be slanted towards or away from the sun. And that's what you have with the solstice. When you have that word solstice, that's referring to a maximum distance or minimum distance, not distance so much, but a maximum and minimum directness towards the sun. So for the northern hemisphere in June, this is when our tilt towards the sun is at its greatest, and the sunlight is most direct onto that land or water in the northern hemisphere. So this is actually, the June solstice is usually the 21st or 22nd of June, and that's the first day of summer. And then in December, you have what's called the winter solstice, which is when the northern hemisphere is tilted away and the sunlight is the least direct. This also is going to affect time of day or how many daylight hours you have. And then the halfway point between those two are what we call the equinox, which is the first day of spring and the first day of autumn. All right, now, depending on that time of year, you may have more or less direct sunlight. So that's going to provide basically more daylight hours and hotter temperatures typically. I doubt you would ever be asked about this, but you may have heard of the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. The significance of those is that between these two regions of latitude, it is actually possible to get a sun that is directly overhead, maximum direct solar exposure, where basically at that perfectly overhead point, you would not cast a shadow. So within this region of the Earth, you can get, maximum direct sunlight. Now, it's not just temperature, though, that is affected by this. I guess that is what's directly affected. But based on how direct of sunlight you get and the heat that's generated from that, you can get these kind of air cycles where hot air rises, cools off, and then descends and continues in kind of a loop like that. This is going to affect precipitation. So as this air begins to rise and cool off, you get precipitation in these regions. When that air is dry, cools off enough to descend back down the earth, there is less precipitation. So this wind cycling is going to affect whether you have a region that gets more or less precipitation, rainfall. You can kind of overlay that. These cycles kind of turn differently depending on where you are. But if you look, dry air falls upon the Sahara Desert, Dry air falls upon the Kalahari Desert. It falls upon the very dry southern tip of South America. So you can find very dry regions of land based on how this air is cycling around. It's also going to affect direction of different winds. So you get these westerlies and trade winds. These are major wind patterns across the globe that are affected by how this air is cycling up and down in the atmosphere. All, again, related to our tilt and how direct the sunlight is. Wind patterns are going to affect ocean currents. So you have these major ocean currents with cooler water coming near the equator, warming up, cycling up into cooler waters again. These currents affect weather patterns and temperature on the coast, near where they are, and they affect which fish and what kind of aquatic systems you have throughout the world. So, the position of the Earth relative to the sun affects wind and ocean climates. There are land features like mountains that can have a serious effect on the climate of a region. It is very common to see this effect, what we call rain shadows, where you have a mountain range near the coast. When water with a lot of moisture in it moves inland, it actually will drop most of that precipitation as that air moves up the mountain, and you get a lot of rain on what we call the windward side, the side that the wind hits. That precipitation is then lost, and as you move to the other side of the mountain range, you have what we call the leeward side that does not get that precipitation because it already fell out of the air on the windward side. So you do have regions where mountain ranges can drastically affect kind of the ecological systems on either side of the mountain. And of course, that's going to have a huge effect on what kind of life you find. Also, how vegetated a region is. Now, this is not necessarily directly related to the Earth's position to the sun. But in more vegetated, forested regions, the air tends to retain more moisture. Water is trapped by plants, slowly released. Forests actually can cause it to rain. Forests can change the temperature of a region. When you don't have those forests, whether that's through man-made activity or just naturally, you lose a lot of that water, you have less precipitation, and you have a drier landscape. You should never see bare ground. It should be covered with plant life if you want a good temperature regulation and if you want rain. All of these factors cause the world to be divided up into what we call biomes. B-I-O-M-E-S, biomes. And this is what we're going to discuss for the rest of this section today. And we don't really have we have a lot of slides, but mostly it's just pictures to look at and go, oh. You can see the color coding patterns up here. And these are going to be your major biomes that you find around the world. Most of them, just based on the name, I think you could, you're familiar with them. Either you've seen them, visited them on vacation or traveling. Usually the only ones that people may not be as familiar with is the chaparral, which is a fairly rare one, but if you notice here, it's kind of the Mediterranean region, a little bit in California, a few other places. We're going to look at each of these and in terms of what you would need to know for the AP exam, I would just basically have a general idea of what you find in each of these biomes. But these separate biomes are going to represent distinctly different regions where the animal life and the plant life is going to be different. And it's usually different in a way that makes it, more fit for that biome. All right. Now, what really determines the biome? Well, it's two things: temperature and precipitation. Those two things are basically how you can define a biome. So as you move up the y-axis here, and this is actually how you would probably be asked about something like this on the AP exam, is being given some kind of graphical representation of the data. But the higher you move up on the y-axis, the hotter. And then the further you move out on the x-axis here, the more precipitation. So the more water that falls from the sky. And what you find is that it's those two factors that determine whether you have a desert, tundra, or some sort of forest. And a lot of them are pretty simple, I think. I think when you look at a tropical forest, we're talking about lots of precipitation and high temperatures. When you're talking about the tundra, there's not as much precipitation and low temperatures. What determines desert regions? Just typically low precipitation. Now, we think of deserts a lot of times as being warm or hot places, and that is true. A lot of deserts are very hot, especially during the day. But you can actually have some fairly cooler regions that are still deserts.
Aren't deserts like really cold at night?
They can be much colder at night and much hotter during the day. And a lot of that is because the vegetation, the plant life is reduced and doesn't hold as much water to the ground. Water has a high specific heat and really helps kind of regulate temperatures. And then, of course, forests of various types are found, in a variety of regions, but you really need a certain amount of precipitation to support, a large community of plants like a forest. Now, just to go through global biome tour here. I like these. These are all in your book. I would take a minute just to look at them in your reading. You do not need to be able to color code where they are found. But of course here we have tropical rainforests. These are much more equatorial, centered around the equator because of the high temperatures, but also high precipitation. But I think most of you are familiar with a tropical forest. Deserts are simply going to be regions where you have the least precipitation. And a lot of this is just because of because of wind patterns. So there are just certain regions where you have drier air because of the way wind patterns move and cycle. And that's typically going to lead you to an area with less vegetation. It's drier. That tends to cause it to fluctuate a lot more in terms of temperature ranges. The savanna, which is a unique biome with some trees, but mostly grassland. Not quite a forest, not completely grassland. This is the one people are usually least familiar with, the chaparral. You can see that there are very few regions. If you went out into one, you might think you were near a desert. It is marked or characterized by a drier climate, but not as dry as a desert. I would say you don't have the cactus you would expect to find in a desert. You would have definitely more kind of what we call scrubland, shrubby growth, but not devoid of vegetation near as much as a desert would be. the chaparral. This is in California. You have grasslands, which are, don't really have the precipitation to support entire forests, but enough to support the grasses. Which, by the way, grass is a fairly new plant. It just showed up about 30 million years ago, and it really changed kind of the entire ecology of the globe. And then you have a variety of forests. Colder forests typically are coniferous. You can see kind of this coniferous band here. These tend to be higher elevation, like in mountains, or in kind of cooler, somewhat drier regions. We have conifers here. What's our really common conifer in the southeast?
Pine.
Yeah, pine trees. Pine trees are a conifer. But you also have cedar trees and other evergreens that produce cones. That's what this term coniferous, that refers to the cone, as opposed to like a fruit, like an apple. It's got a cone as its fruit. Typically evergreen, so they are going to try to photosynthesize all year long. They grow very slowly because they just don't typically get the warm temperatures and the precipitation that most plants usually require. And a lot of them have pretty distinct smells. The Christmas tree smell is what you get a lot of times from coniferous plants. And some of that is actually special chemicals that act as antifreeze. And instead of leaves, what do you tend to find?
Pines.
Like needles. That's right. They typically have much more reduced leaf structures, which we call needles, not in all cases, but a lot of coniferous trees do. And that also helps them kind of combat dry and cold conditions. And then the broadleaf forest that we're a little bit more familiar with in this region. We have kind of a weird scenario in the southeast where when you strip the land away of vegetation, the first trees that usually show up are actually the coniferous ones. But then, if you let the forest grow for a few centuries, in this region, the pine trees usually get replaced with your typical leaved, broadleaf trees like oaks and maples and things like that. So we are in a broadleaf forest region. And then finally, this is not all of the ones listed, but the tundra. Look at that really high northern band of tundra. Not enough precipitation to support trees, and it's just too cold as well. You usually have specialized plants, grow very low to the ground, animals that are reliant on just kind of this minimal foraging and migrating through the tundra. And a lot of times in the tundra, you have a layer of ground pretty close to the surface that stays frozen, called the permafrost. Unusual biome that, we would consider life there to be very difficult as a human. So read through those, be familiar with the biomes, and understand that it's temperature and precipitation that affects those. The temperature and precipitation of those regions really all goes back to the position of the Earth's tilt towards or away from the sun. Make sure I see your Unit 7 notes. And today, Wednesday and Friday, once I'm done with the lecture, you have time for your evolutionary video project work that will be due by midnight, Sunday, May 2nd. So basically, I will grade them as, the first school day of May, I'll start grading them. All right, thank you. Do you want to hit stop there on that?
I can't, which side is it on? That side?
You can just turn it towards you if you want to be on camera.
I don't.